Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. At 11:47 p.m., a static noise was heard on the radio. Magnus Elling had grown accustomed to such sounds while working on the northern section of the Dalton Highway in the middle of winter. The outside temperature was minus 42 degrees Fahrenheit, so cold that exposed skin would freeze in less than 3 minutes. Motor oil would thicken to the consistency of mud, and metals would become as brittle as glass. Magnus had been patrolling this area between Coldfoot and Deadhorse for 6 years. That time had been more than enough for him to learn that the Arctic tolerated no mistakes, offered no second chances, and cared nothing for a man's intentions or the badge he wore on his chest. The highway stretched out before him into endless darkness. The light from his headlights advanced like a narrow tunnel through the night, revealing only a white void and, occasionally, a few reflective markers reminding him that the road still existed. Those markers ensured drivers didn't accidentally veer off into the tundra, because once lost, they were usually not found until spring thaws uncovered their frozen vehicles. The call from Rowan came through at 11:52 p.m., her voice tight with the kind of tension that suggested she was reading from incident reports rather than relaying routine information. Unit 7, this is dispatch. We've got a priority locate on Trooper Cole Strindberg. Last contact was 1900 hours reporting a disabled vehicle at mile marker 287. GPS shows his unit stationary at that location, but he's not responding to radio checks. Air support is grounded due to weather conditions. You're the closest unit by approximately 90 miles. Advise your ETA and approach with caution, given the extreme cold and communication difficulties. Magnus acknowledged the transmission and felt his stomach tighten with the knowledge that 90 miles in these conditions meant at least 2 hours of careful driving. Assuming the road remained passable, and his own vehicle didn't succumb to the cold that was already making his engine labor despite the Arctic-grade diesel and the constant idling he maintained whenever he stopped moving. Cole had been working the Dalton for almost as long as Magnus, though their paths rarely crossed, given the vast distances they each covered during 12-hour shifts that began in darkness and ended in darkness during the winter months when sunlight was a memory from another season. The Dalton Highway was known as one of the most dangerous roads in North America, a 414-mile supply route that connected the Arctic Ocean to the interior of Alaska, carrying primarily heavy trucks servicing the oil fields at Prudhoe Bay. The road was unpaved for most of its length, carved through mountains and tundra with grades that challenged even experienced drivers during the brief summer months, and became nearly impassable during winter when ice, snow, and wind combined to create conditions that killed the unprepared with mechanical efficiency. There were no services for stretches exceeding 100 miles, no cell phone coverage, and no rescue infrastructure beyond the occasional truck stop or construction camp that might offer shelter if you could reach it before hypothermia or mechanical failure ended your journey permanently. Magnus increased his speed to 40 miles per hour, the maximum he considered safe given the ice-packed surface and the crosswinds that periodically slammed into his vehicle with enough force to push it sideways across the narrow roadway. His headlights occasionally caught the reflective eyes of caribou or wolves watching from the darkness, reminders that the wilderness pressed close on both sides of the thin ribbon of road that represented the only human presence for hundreds of square miles. He ran through scenarios in his mind, trying to determine what could have caused Cole to go silent for over 4 hours. A disabled vehicle was common enough in these temperatures, but Cole would have called for assistance immediately, and would have maintained radio contact while waiting for help to arrive. The fact that his GPS showed the vehicle stationary but there was no communication suggested either catastrophic equipment failure or something more troubling that prevented Cole from accessing his radio. The wind had picked up considerably by the time Magnus passed mile marker 250, reducing visibility to perhaps 30 feet and creating whiteout conditions that forced him to slow to 20 miles per hour while navigating by watching the reflective markers that lined the road at regular intervals. Snow devils danced across the highway, miniature tornadoes of ice crystals that reflected his headlights in disorienting patterns that made it difficult to judge distances or identify obstacles until they were dangerously close. He had driven through worse conditions during his years on the Dalton, but the knowledge that Cole was somewhere ahead, silent and possibly in trouble, added a layer of anxiety that made every mile feel like 10, and every minute stretch into something that felt like hours of slow progress through a landscape that seemed designed to destroy human presence and reclaim the territory for the wilderness that had owned it long before the oil companies carved their supply route through the permafrost. Magnus tried raising Cole on the radio every 10 minutes, cycling through all available frequencies including the emergency channels that should have been accessible even if Cole's primary radio system had failed. Each attempt yielded only static, or the occasional broken fragment of transmission that might have been atmospheric interference, or might have been something trying to reach him from the darkness beyond his headlights. The GPS continued to show Cole's unit at mile marker 287, stationary and silent, an electronic ghost that confirmed the vehicle was still there but offered no insight into the condition of the trooper who should have been inside it waiting for assistance and maintaining the protocols that kept isolated officers connected to the support network that was their only lifeline in this environment. At 1:23 a.m., Magnus spotted the flashing emergency lights of Cole's patrol unit in the distance, the red and blue strobes creating a surreal light show against the blowing snow that made the scene look like something from a fever dream rather than a routine assist call. He slowed his approach, scanning the area for any signs of the disabled vehicle that had supposedly prompted Cole's stop, but saw nothing except the patrol unit sitting at an angle that suggested it had pulled off the road to investigate something rather than being disabled itself. The engine was running. He could see exhaust vapor rising from the tailpipe and dissipating immediately in the brutal cold, but there was no sign of movement inside the vehicle or any indication that Cole was aware of his approach, despite the obvious presence of Magnus's headlights and the sound of his engine that should have been audible even through the wind. Magnus positioned his vehicle 40 feet behind Cole's unit, angling it to provide illumination while keeping his engine running and his own emergency lights activated to mark the scene for any traffic that might approach, though in these conditions, and at this hour, the likelihood of encountering another vehicle was minimal. He gathered his cold weather gear, pulling on the expedition weight parka that was rated to minus 60 degrees, the face mask that would protect his exposed skin from instant frostbite, and the insulated gloves that would give him perhaps 15 minutes of dexterity before his fingers became too numb to function effectively. The preparation took 3 minutes, time that felt wasteful when Cole might be in immediate danger, but rushing into the Arctic cold without proper protection was a mistake that ended careers and lives with equal finality. The wind hit Magnus like a physical blow when he opened his door, carrying ice crystals that stung any exposed skin and created a wind chill that pushed the effective temperature well below minus 60 degrees. He moved quickly toward Cole's unit, fighting against wind gusts that threatened to knock him off balance, and noting that the area around the patrol vehicle showed signs of recent activity. Footprints in the snow that led away from the driver's door and disappeared into the darkness beyond the reach of his flashlight. The driver's door was closed but not locked, and when Magnus pulled it open he found the interior empty except for Cole's radio handset lying on the driver's seat as if it had been carefully placed there rather than dropped in haste. The engine was running smoothly, the heater was functioning normally, and all equipment appeared to be operational. eliminating mechanical failure as an explanation for Cole's silence and absence from his vehicle. Magnus keyed his own radio, reporting his findings to Rowan and requesting any additional information about Cole's last transmission that might explain what he had been investigating when he left his vehicle. Dispatch, Unit 7. I'm on scene at 287. Subject vehicle is running and appears operational, but Trooper Cole is not present. I've got footprints leading north from the driver's door, approximately one set, possibly our missing officer. Weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly with wind chills approaching -70. I'm going to follow the tracks, but I need you to maintain constant contact and be prepared to coordinate rescue operations if I don't report back within 30 minutes. Rowan's response came through clearly, despite the conditions, her voice carrying the controlled concern of someone who understood the severity of the situation. Copy, Unit 7. Be advised that Trooper Cole's last transmission indicated he was investigating what he described as emergency flares visible approximately 1/4 mile north of the highway. He stated he was proceeding on foot to check for possible accident victims. That was at 1900 hours. No subsequent contact has been established. The information changed everything Magnus had been thinking about the situation. Emergency flares would explain why Cole had left his vehicle and ventured into the darkness on foot, and the possibility of accident victims in these conditions would have compelled any trooper to investigate immediately despite the obvious dangers. But 4.5 hours had passed since that transmission, far longer than it would take to walk a 1/4 mile, assess a scene, and return to the vehicle or call for assistance. Something had prevented Cole from completing what should have been a straightforward rescue operation, and Magnus was now following the same path that had led his fellow trooper into a situation that had apparently incapacitated or trapped him somewhere in the darkness beyond the highway. The footprints were already being obscured by blowing snow, but they were still visible enough to follow. A single track leading away from the highway in a straight line that suggested Cole had been walking with purpose toward a specific destination rather than wandering aimlessly in the darkness. Magnus followed the tracks for approximately 200 yards, fighting against wind that seemed determined to push him back toward the highway, and struggling with the knowledge that he was now committed to a course of action that put him at significant risk if conditions deteriorated further or if he became disoriented and lost the track back to the vehicles. His flashlight beam penetrated perhaps 20 feet through the blowing snow, creating a narrow cone of visibility that revealed nothing but endless tundra and the footprints that continued ahead in an unwavering straight line. The tracks showed no signs of hesitation or deviation, suggesting that Cole had been able to see his destination clearly when he made this walk. But Magnus could see no flares, no lights, no indication of any emergency that would have justified venturing this far from the safety of a running vehicle in conditions that could kill within minutes. At approximately 300 yards from the highway, Magnus discovered Cole's flashlight lying in the snow, still operational but pointing back towards the road as if it had been deliberately placed to mark a trail rather than dropped accidentally. The discovery was troubling because Cole would never have abandoned his primary light source unless he had found something that made the flashlight unnecessary, or had encountered a situation that made it impossible to carry equipment. Magnus picked up the flashlight and scanned the area ahead, now using both lights to penetrate the darkness, and approximately 50 feet further he spotted what appeared to be a depression in the snow that might indicate a vehicle or structure buried beneath the accumulation of recent storms. The depression was roughly rectangular, perhaps 15 feet long and 6 feet wide, and showed signs of disturbance that suggested someone had recently been digging or clearing snow from whatever lay beneath the surface. Magnus approached the depression cautiously, aware that snow could conceal anything from abandoned equipment to unstable ground that might collapse beneath his weight. As he got closer, his lights revealed what appeared to be the roof of a vehicle, a truck or large SUV that had been buried by snow to a depth of at least 4 feet, completely concealing it from the highway and making it invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically searching this area on foot. Someone had cleared snow from a section of the driver's side, creating an opening that led down to what Magnus assumed was a door or window, and tracks around the depression indicated that Cole had spent considerable time and effort excavating this access point, possibly in an attempt to reach victims who might be trapped inside the buried vehicle. Magnus called out Cole's name, his voice immediately torn away by the wind, but hopefully loud enough to penetrate into the buried vehicle if Cole was inside attempting to assist trapped occupants. No response came back, only the constant howl of wind and the creaking protest of ice-laden equipment on his gear belt. He moved to the excavated opening and directed both flashlights down into the depression, revealing a driver's side window that had been partially cleared of snow and appeared to be intact. The glass was frosted on the inside, indicating that the vehicle had been sealed long enough for condensation to freeze on the interior surfaces, a process that suggested the vehicle had been here for days, or possibly weeks rather than hours. If there had been living occupants inside, they would have consumed the available oxygen long before Cole arrived on scene. But the possibility of bodies requiring recovery would have kept Cole working at the excavation despite the brutal conditions. Magnus positioned himself at the edge of the excavated opening and used his flashlight to examine the interior of the buried vehicle through the driver's window. What he saw made no sense given the circumstances and the amount of effort Cole had put into reaching this point. The vehicle's interior was completely empty. No bodies, no personal effects, no indication that anyone had ever been inside this truck when it became buried in the snow. The seats were bare, the dashboard was clear of any objects, and there was no debris or evidence of occupation visible anywhere in the front compartment. It appeared to be a vehicle that had simply been abandoned in this location and allowed to be buried by successive snowstorms, not an accident scene with victims requiring rescue. Not an emergency that would justify the response Cole had mounted, or explain why he had spent what must have been hours digging through snow to access an empty vehicle. Magnus tried his radio again, this time reporting the discovery of the buried vehicle and the troubling absence of both Cole and any victims who might have justified this elaborate rescue attempt. Dispatch Unit 7. I've located the subject of Trooper Cole's investigation. It's a buried vehicle approximately 300 yards north of the highway. Appears to be a full-size truck completely covered by snow. Trooper Cole excavated an access point to the driver's side, but the vehicle interior is empty. No victims present and no sign of Trooper Cole at this location. I'm going to expand my search pattern, but I need to advise that conditions are deteriorating rapidly, and I'm approaching my safety limits for time in these temperatures. Rowan's response was immediate, and carried a new edge of concern that suggested she was consulting with supervisors about how to proceed. Copy Unit 7. Be advised that we're coordinating with aviation for first light extraction if needed. Can you determine how long the vehicle has been at that location? Magnus moved around the buried truck, examining what he could see of its exterior through the areas where Cole's excavation had exposed metal and glass. The vehicle was a late-model pickup, possibly less than 5 years old based on the design elements visible through the snow, and it bore commercial markings that suggested it might be associated with one of the oil field service companies that operated in the Prudhoe Bay area. But what caught Magnus's attention and sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with the Arctic cold was the discovery of a second set of footprints leading away from the far side of the excavation site. Tracks that were being rapidly obscured by blowing snow, but were still visible enough to indicate that someone had left this location recently, possibly within the last hour, based on how much wind drift had accumulated in the depressions. The second set of tracks was larger than Cole's distinctive boot print pattern, suggesting a different individual, and they led away from the buried vehicle in a direction that would take the walker deeper into the tundra rather than back toward the highway where help and warmth waited. Magnus followed these new tracks for approximately 50 feet, his mind racing with possibilities that ranged from Cole pursuing someone who had been at the buried vehicle to the existence of a third party involved in whatever situation had developed at this isolated location. The tracks showed a steady walking pace rather than running, suggesting that whoever made them was moving with purpose rather than fleeing in panic, and they appeared to be relatively fresh despite the conditions that should have obscured them within minutes of being made. At 75 feet from the buried vehicle, Magnus discovered items of equipment that he immediately recognized as standard Alaska State Trooper issue. Cole's radio handset lay in the snow, the device that should have been clipped to his duty belt or at minimum retained in his vehicle, abandoned here in conditions that would destroy the electronics within minutes of exposure to the extreme cold. 10 feet beyond the radio, Magnus found Cole's service weapon, a Glock 22 that had been carefully placed in the snow rather than dropped, positioned as if someone had deliberately marked a trail with equipment that would be immediately recognizable to any law enforcement officer who might be following. The discoveries were beyond troubling because they suggested that Cole had either voluntarily abandoned critical equipment or had been compelled to leave these items behind by someone or something that had gained control of the situation. Magnus keyed his radio with hands that were beginning to lose sensation despite his insulated gloves, reporting the discovery of Cole's equipment and the indication that his fellow trooper had moved deeper into the tundra for reasons that made no sense given standard procedures or survival protocols. Dispatch, Unit 7. I've recovered Trooper Cole's radio and service weapon. Items appear to have been deliberately placed rather than dropped. I'm following tracks that lead away from the buried vehicle site, but I need to advise that I'm now at critical exposure time and must make a decision about whether to continue pursuit or return to vehicles and await additional resources. The silence that followed his transmission lasted nearly 15 seconds, an eternity when every moment in these conditions increased the risk of catastrophic cold injury or disorientation that could leave 2 troopers missing instead of 1. Rowan's voice, when it came through, carried the weight of command decisions being made in real time by people who understood both the urgency of locating Cole and the reality that sending Magnus further into the Arctic darkness might result in 2 casualties instead of 1. Unit 7, this is dispatch. Command advises you to mark your current location and return to your vehicle. We're coordinating with North Slope SAR for first light operations, and we need you functional to guide the search teams when they arrive. You've done everything possible under the circumstances. Come back to base, and we'll regroup with proper resources. Magnus stared at the tracks leading away into darkness, knowing that Cole was out there somewhere, possibly injured or trapped, possibly being led or forced away from safety by someone whose presence and motives remained unknown. Every instinct told him to continue following the trail while it was still visible, but training and experience reinforced what Rowan was telling him, that he was already operating beyond safe limits and pushing further would likely result in his own incapacitation. He marked his position using one of the highway flares from his emergency kit, the bright red flame creating a beacon that would be visible from considerable distance and would help search teams locate this position when operations resumed at first light. The flare's light revealed the tracks continuing away into the darkness, and Magnus could swear he saw movement at the edge of his vision, a shadow or shape that might have been wind-blown snow or might have been something else moving just beyond the reach of illumination. He called out one final time, his voice hoarse from breathing the brutally cold air that seared his lungs with each breath. "Cole, if you can hear me, I'm marking this position and returning to base. Help is coming at first light. If you can make it back to the vehicles, both engines are running and heaters are operational. Follow the flare back to this position and then follow my tracks back to the highway." The return walk to the patrol vehicles took Magnus 18 minutes. Fighting against wind that seemed to have increased in velocity, and struggling with the disorientation that came from exhaustion and cold exposure that was beginning to affect his cognitive function. He stumbled twice on terrain that should have been easily navigable, caught himself before falling only by luck rather than coordination, and felt the beginning stages of hypothermia creeping into his core, despite the expedition-weight clothing that was supposed to protect him from exactly this situation. When he finally reached his vehicle and climbed inside, the heater's warmth felt like fire against his exposed skin, and he had to spend several minutes simply breathing and allowing his body temperature to stabilize before he could trust himself to operate the vehicle safely. Magnus sat in his patrol unit for 40 minutes, engine running and heater at maximum, watching Cole's vehicle in the darkness beyond for any sign of movement that might indicate his fellow trooper was returning from whatever had drawn him into the tundra. The radio remained silent except for periodic check-ins from Rowan, confirming that search and rescue resources were being staged at Coldfoot and would deploy at first light, weather permitting. The GPS continued to show Cole's unit in its stationary position, the electronic confirmation of presence that meant nothing when the officer who should be occupying that vehicle was somewhere in the Arctic darkness following a trail that made no sense and abandoning equipment that should never be separated from an Alaska State Trooper under any circumstances. At 3:47 a.m., Magnus made the decision to return to Coldfoot, where he could brief the incoming search teams and prepare for what was likely to be an extensive recovery operation rather than a rescue. He documented the scene with photographs that barely penetrated the darkness and blowing snow, collected Cole's radio handset from the patrol vehicle as evidence that might provide some clue about what had happened, and finally put his vehicle in gear for the long drive south toward the last outpost of civilization before the Arctic truly began. As he drove away, his headlights swept across Cole's patrol unit one final time, the emergency lights still flashing their futile warning into a night that had already claimed one trooper and might yet claim others before this situation resolved. The drive back to Coldfoot was worse than the drive north had been, with wind speeds that pushed his vehicle across the road despite his best efforts to maintain a straight course and visibility that deteriorated to near zero during several stretches where he was forced to navigate purely by feel and memory of the road's characteristics. He passed scattered caribou that watched his progress with eyes that reflected his headlights in shades of green and gold, the animals seemingly unconcerned by the storm that was making human activity nearly impossible. Twice, he had to stop and clear ice buildup from his windshield wipers, each time exposing himself to cold that seemed to have intensified during the hours he had spent searching for Cole, and each time struggling with the knowledge that his fellow trooper was still out there somewhere, possibly watching vehicles pass by on the highway that represented his only chance of survival. Magnus reached the truck stop at Coldfoot at 5:23 a.m., pulling into the parking area where search and rescue teams were already assembling their equipment and preparing for deployment as soon as weather conditions permitted aerial operations. He was met by the operations coordinator, a veteran of Arctic rescues who took one look at Magnus's condition and immediately ordered him inside for warm fluids and medical evaluation before any debriefing would take place. The coordinator's concern was justified because Magnus was showing signs of moderate hypothermia despite his protective gear, and the heated vehicle, his core temperature had dropped to dangerous levels during the extended exposure and the stress of the search operation, and he would need several hours of controlled rewarming before he could safely participate in further operations. The debriefing took place in the truck stop's restaurant. Magnus, wrapped in emergency blankets and drinking hot soup while he described everything he had found at mile marker 287 and the trail that had led him 300 yards into the tundra before command had ordered his withdrawal. The search coordinator listened carefully, making notes and asking clarifying questions about the buried vehicle, the pattern of Cole's excavation work, and the disturbing discovery of equipment that had been deliberately placed in the snow, as if marking a trail for followers. When Magnus described the second set of footprints, and the indication that someone besides Cole had been at the buried vehicle site recently, the coordinator's expression shifted from concerned to deeply troubled, suggesting that this detail changed the nature of the operation from a simple lost officer scenario to something more complex and potentially dangerous. "We've got a problem," the coordinator said after Magnus had finished his account and provided all the details he could remember from the scene. "That buried vehicle you found matches the description of a truck that went missing from Deadhorse approximately 3 weeks ago. It was reported stolen from an oil services company's yard, and we assumed it had been taken south toward Fairbanks. But if it's buried at mile marker 287, then someone drove it deliberately into the tundra and concealed it there for reasons we need to understand. The fact that Trooper Cole excavated it and then apparently followed someone away from the site suggests he discovered something about that vehicle, or its occupant, that compelled him to pursue, despite the conditions and despite abandoning proper procedure. The revelation added context to the mystery but raised more questions than it answered. Why would someone steal a truck from Deadhorse and bury it in the tundra 300 yards from the highway? What had Cole discovered in or around that vehicle that made him willing to abandon his radio and weapon while pursuing someone into the Arctic darkness? And who was the person whose tracks Magnus had followed? Someone who had apparently been at the buried vehicle site recently enough that their footprints were still partially visible despite conditions that should have erased them within minutes. The search coordinator was already organizing teams and planning approach vectors based on Magnus's description of the location. But everyone in the room understood that searching for a missing person in the Arctic during winter was an operation with very limited chances of success, particularly when that person had been missing for over 10 hours in conditions that could kill within minutes. The first helicopter lifted off at 7:15 a.m., just as the first hint of twilight was beginning to show on the eastern horizon, the pilot fighting winds that made flying dangerous but choosing to launch anyway because every minute of delay reduced the chances of finding Cole alive. Magnus watched the aircraft disappear into the gray dawn, its navigation lights blinking against clouds that seemed to press down on the landscape with physical weight. Additional teams were being staged at the search site, arriving in tracked vehicles that could navigate the tundra conditions, bringing equipment and expertise that might make the difference between recovery and loss. But Magnus understood from the expressions of the experienced search personnel that hope was minimal when an Alaska State Trooper went missing in these conditions, particularly when that trooper had apparently abandoned survival protocols to pursue someone or something into an environment that killed without mercy or hesitation. The search operation continued for 6 days, expanding in radius from the buried vehicle site and employing every resource available to Alaska's search and rescue network. Teams on foot, snowmobiles, tracked vehicles, and aircraft when weather permitted, all searching for any sign of Cole or the mysterious individual whose tracks had led away from the excavation site. They found nothing beyond the items Magnus had already discovered. No additional equipment, no clothing, no indication of where Cole had gone or what had happened to him after he abandoned his weapon and radio in the snow. The buried truck was recovered and examined thoroughly, yielding no evidence that explained why it had been concealed at that location or what Cole had discovered that compelled him to pursue someone away from the vehicle. The investigation into the buried truck revealed that it had been driven to the concealment location deliberately. The tire tracks showed a controlled approach rather than an accident or emergency situation, and it had been carefully positioned in a depression that would allow snow to bury it completely within a few storms. The interior had been wiped clean of fingerprints and DNA evidence, suggesting professional attention to avoiding detection, and the vehicle's GPS system had been removed to prevent tracking. What purpose the truck had served in this remote location remained unclear, but investigators theorized it might have been used as a cache point for smuggling operations, or as a supply depot for someone operating in the area without authorization or legal sanity. 3 weeks after Cole's disappearance, a Wolverine trapper working a line approximately 12 miles north of the highway discovered what appeared to be a survival shelter constructed from snow blocks and natural materials, the kind of emergency structure that someone with winter training might build if stranded without equipment or transportation. Inside the shelter, searchers found Cole's parka, carefully folded and placed in a configuration that suggested it had been left deliberately rather than abandoned in haste. The parka was undamaged and showed no signs of blood or violence, but its presence raised the disturbing question of why Cole would remove critical cold weather gear in an environment where such action would result in death within minutes. The shelter's location was analyzed in relation to the buried vehicle site and the trail Magnus had followed on the night of the initial search. The trajectory suggested that Cole had been moving in a specific direction rather than wandering aimlessly, following a course that would have taken him toward a series of abandoned seismic testing camps that dated from exploration operations conducted decades earlier. The camps had been dismantled long ago, but their locations remained on geological survey maps, and some still contained debris or equipment that might provide shelter for someone who knew where to look and how to utilize the remains effectively. Search teams moved to the abandoned camp locations, finding evidence of recent occupation at one site approximately 18 miles from where Cole had last been seen. Someone had been living in one of the old equipment sheds that still had partial walls and roof, using materials scavenged from the surrounding area to create a shelter that would be invisible from the air and difficult to find even for someone searching on foot. The shelter contained supplies that suggested weeks of occupation, including food containers, fuel canisters, and cold weather gear that bore no identification but appeared to be military surplus acquired through unknown channels. What the shelter didn't contain was any indication of who had been using it or where they had gone when the search operations began focusing on this area. DNA evidence recovered from the shelter eventually provided answers that were more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. The genetic material matched a former oil field worker named Marcus, who had been reported missing from Dead Horse 6 months earlier, under circumstances that had never been fully explained. Marcus had worked for one of the service companies supporting drilling operations, had been described by supervisors as competent but increasingly erratic, and had disappeared after being confronted about suspicious activities involving company equipment and vehicles. The fact that Marcus had apparently been living in the Arctic wilderness for months, surviving conditions that would kill unprepared individuals within hours, suggested either extreme survival skills or a mental state that had progressed beyond rational decision-making. The investigation revealed that Marcus had been stealing supplies from various oil field facilities, using knowledge gained during his employment to access storage areas and equipment yards without triggering security protocols. The stolen truck had been one of several vehicles he had taken and hidden at various locations across the North Slope, creating a network of resources that allowed him to survive away from civilization while avoiding detection by law enforcement or corporate security. What remained unclear was why Marcus had chosen this existence over simply leaving Alaska or seeking help for whatever psychological issues were driving his behavior, and what interaction with Cole had occurred that led the trooper to abandon safety protocols while pursuing someone into the Arctic wilderness. 4 months after Cole's disappearance, spring breakup revealed his body approximately 23 miles from the highway, positioned in a natural drainage that had been hidden beneath snow during the winter months. The medical examiner determined that Cole had died from exposure, his core temperature dropping to fatal levels during the hours he spent pursuing Marcus across the tundra without adequate protection from the cold. But the examination also revealed details that suggested Cole's death wasn't simply the result of getting lost or making poor decisions during the pursuit. Cole's equipment belt showed signs of having been removed and replaced. His boots had been retied in a manner inconsistent with his known habits, and his body position suggested that he had been moved after death to the location where he was discovered, arranged in a way that seemed deliberately theatrical, rather than the random positioning that would result from someone collapsing from hypothermia. The evidence pointed toward a confrontation between Cole and Marcus that had resulted in the trooper's death, possibly through deliberate exposure to fatal cold rather than direct violence, followed by careful staging of the body at a location where it would be found during spring melt. But without Marcus to provide answers, the exact sequence of events remained speculative and frustrating for investigators who needed to understand what had motivated a former oil worker to kill an Alaska State Trooper and then vanish into the Arctic wilderness without leaving traces that modern forensic science and extensive search operations could locate or interpret. Marcus was never found despite extensive efforts that continued for over a year after Cole's body was recovered. Search operations expanded to cover hundreds of square miles of tundra and mountains, interviewing anyone who had known Marcus during his oil field employment and investigating every possible resource he might have used to sustain himself in the wilderness. Some searchers believed he had died somewhere in the vast Arctic wilderness, his body concealed by terrain or consumed by scavengers that left no trace for human discovery. Others maintained that Marcus had successfully escaped the search area, possibly crossing into Canada or making his way to one of the coastal communities where a person could disappear among transient populations that asked few questions about backgrounds or origins. For Magnus, who had been the last law enforcement officer to follow Cole's trail before weather and command decisions forced his withdrawal, the case became a permanent weight that influenced every decision and colored every patrol shift on the Dalton Highway. He continued working the northern sectors, but approached every call with enhanced caution and every abandoned vehicle with the knowledge that routine investigations could spiral into tragedies that defied explanation or prevention. The memory of following Cole's equipment trail into the darkness, discovering items that should never be abandoned by an Alaska State Trooper, remained vivid years after the incident and served as constant reminder that the Arctic didn't recognize badges or training or good intentions when it claimed victims. The buried truck remained a mystery within the larger mystery, its purpose and connection to Marcus's survival strategy never fully explained. Some investigators theorized it had been intended as a long-term cache point for supplies stolen from oilfield facilities, while others believed it represented the beginning of a more elaborate plan that Marcus had been forced to abandon when Cole discovered the excavation site and initiated pursuit. The truck was eventually returned to the oil services company that owned it, but not before every component had been examined for evidence that might explain why a man would steal a vehicle, bury it in the tundra miles from any road, and then defend its location with actions that resulted in a trooper's death. Rowan continued working dispatch at the Alaska State Trooper Communications Center in Fairbanks, but she never forgot the night she coordinated search operations for a missing trooper and listened as Magnus described following equipment trails into darkness that concealed horrors beyond the simple dangers of Arctic winter. She became an advocate for enhanced safety protocols for troopers working alone in remote areas, pushing for requirements that included mandatory check-ins at shorter intervals and GPS tracking systems that couldn't be disabled or abandoned even under extreme circumstances. Her efforts led to policy changes that might prevent future tragedies, but nothing could change the reality that Cole's death had occurred despite existing protocols and the dedicated efforts of everyone involved in the search operations. The memorial erected at mile marker 287 includes Cole's badge number and the simple inscription, "In service of others," a phrase that captured the dedication that led him to pursue a suspect into conditions that he knew were likely fatal. The memorial serves as reminder to travelers on the Dalton Highway that the troopers who patrol this dangerous road accept risks that go beyond the obvious hazards of weather and terrain, confronting human threats that can emerge from the wilderness with the same deadly force as blizzards or equipment failures. fresh flowers appear at the memorial periodically, left by fellow troopers who understand that Cole's death represents a sacrifice that could be demanded of any of them during routine patrols on America's most dangerous highway. The case files on Cole's death and Marcus's disappearance remain open, officially unsolved despite the evidence that points toward murder and the extensive investigations that consumed thousands of hours of law enforcement time and resources. The Alaska Bureau of Investigation continues to monitor for any indication that Marcus survived his wilderness exile and might surface in locations where his presence could be detected and his actions finally brought to account. But as years pass without new developments, the likelihood diminishes that answers will ever emerge from the Arctic that claimed both a dedicated trooper and the troubled man whose actions ended multiple lives and destroyed the peace of mind that law enforcement officers need to function effectively in isolated environments. For the residents of communities along the Dalton Highway who depend on state troopers for security in an environment where help can be hours away, even during optimal conditions, Cole's death served as a reminder that the officers who protect them are mortal and vulnerable despite their training and equipment. The knowledge added dimension of respect for the troopers who continue patrolling the highway, understanding that each shift brings possibilities that extend beyond traffic enforcement and stranded motorists to include confrontations with individuals whose mental state or criminal intent can transform routine calls into tragedies that echo for years beyond the immediate incident. The Arctic wilderness that surrounds the Dalton Highway continues its eternal indifference to human presence, consuming evidence and concealing secrets with the same efficiency that it tests travelers and punishes the unprepared. Somewhere in that vast expanse of tundra and mountains, answers to Cole's final hours may still exist, preserved in permafrost or scattered across terrain that humans rarely visit and never fully understand. But whether those answers will ever be found remains unknown, dependent on chance discoveries by trappers or researchers, or perhaps eventual confessions by someone who knows the truth and decides that silence has become more burdensome than revelation. The investigation techniques developed during the search for Cole and Marcus have been incorporated into training programs for law enforcement agencies across Alaska and other states where officers work in remote environments with limited support infrastructure. The case serves as an educational tool that illustrates the importance of backup protocols, communication systems that can't be compromised by weather or deliberate interference, and the reality that pursuit decisions made in wilderness environments carry consequences that may not be immediately apparent, but can prove fatal when conditions deteriorate or suspects prove more dangerous than initial assessments suggested. Magnus eventually transferred from the Dalton Highway Patrol to duties in more populated areas where backup was measured in minutes rather than hours, and where the wilderness pressed less immediately against the boundaries of human civilization. But he never forgot the night he followed Cole's trail into the Arctic darkness, discovering abandoned equipment that told story of a pursuit and tragedy that defied complete understanding. The memory influenced every subsequent investigation and colored every interaction with suspects or witnesses who might be concealing information about activities in remote areas where law enforcement presence was minimal, and opportunities for criminal activity were limited only by imagination and willingness to endure hardship. The Dalton Highway continues to carry traffic between the oil fields and the interior of Alaska, its travelers now passing the memorial at mile marker 287 with perhaps a moment's thought for the trooper who died pursuing duty into darkness. The highway's reputation as one of the world's most dangerous roads has been enhanced by Cole's death, adding human predation to the list of hazards that includes weather, terrain, and mechanical challenges that test every vehicle and driver attempting the journey. The Arctic remains indifferent to these human concerns, maintaining its eternal cycle of winter darkness and brief summer light regardless of the tragedies that unfold along the ribbon of road that represents humanity's tenuous claim on this unforgiving landscape. The radio silence that began when Cole failed to respond to routine checks continues in metaphorical sense, his voice absent from the frequencies that carry traffic between isolated troopers and the dispatchers who monitor their safety. That absence serves as constant reminder to current officers that communication is lifeline that must be maintained regardless of circumstances, that abandoning contact with support networks represents decision point from which return may be impossible, and that the Arctic will exploit any vulnerability with efficiency that leaves no room for second chances or rescue operations that arrive minutes too late to prevent tragedy from becoming permanent loss. The call came through at 4:17 a.m. on a Saturday morning in late October, dispatcher's voice carrying the flat affect that Halden had learned to recognize as the tone people used when describing situations that exceeded their capacity for emotional processing. Unit 12, we have a report of 2 bodies discovered at a residence in Tanana. Caller states both victims appear to have been deceased for at least several hours. Village Public Safety Officer is requesting immediate assistance. Weather conditions are marginal but passable for the next 4 hours before the next storm system moves in from the west. Halden acknowledged the transmission and felt the familiar weight settle into his stomach that came with murder investigations in remote Alaskan villages, places where isolation created social pressures that could explode into violence without warning, and where evidence degraded rapidly in conditions that challenged every forensic protocol designed for urban environments. Tanana sat at the confluence of the Tanana and Yukon rivers, a village of fewer than 300 people accessible only by air or water during summer months, and by snow machine or small aircraft during the winter season that was already establishing its grip on interior Alaska. The community was primarily Athabascan, with cultural traditions that stretched back thousands of years and social structures that sometimes conflicted with state law enforcement approaches to investigating crimes that occurred within sovereign boundaries that recognized both tribal and state authority. Halden had worked with the Tanana Village Council on previous cases and understood that success in investigating serious crimes required respecting local protocols while maintaining the evidentiary standards that would support prosecution if cases reached state or federal courts. The flight from Fairbanks took 90 minutes in a Cessna 207 that fought headwinds and turbulence that made instrument flying essential even though visual conditions were technically adequate for the experienced bush pilot who contracted with the Alaskan State Troopers for remote transportation. Halden used the flight time to review what little information was available about the reported homicides. The victims were identified as Frank and Linda, a married couple in their 50s who operated the village's general store and fuel distribution point. They had been discovered by their adult son, who had come to the store to pick up supplies for his fish camp, and found the front door unlocked at an hour when the business should have been secured for the night. The son's call to the village public safety officer had triggered the notification chain that brought Halden from Fairbanks with the full investigative kit that murder cases required in locations where forensic support was hours or days away depending on weather and aircraft availability. The village appeared through the aircraft windows as a scattered collection of structures along the riverbank. Most buildings showing the weathered appearance of construction designed for function rather than aesthetics, in an environment where maintenance was constant challenge and materials were expensive to transport from supply centers. Smoke rose from chimneys and vertical columns that indicated the calm conditions were still holding, despite forecasts of deteriorating weather that would close the airspace to small aircraft within hours. The landing strip was a gravel runway that had been graded during the summer and was now developing the frost heaves that made late-season flying more challenging than the smooth approaches possible during the brief months when the ground wasn't frozen solid beneath its surface layer of displaced rock. Halden was met at the airstrip by the village public safety officer, a young man named Thomas, who had received basic law enforcement training but relied heavily on state troopers for guidance when serious crimes occurred within his jurisdiction. Thomas's expression conveyed both the stress of dealing with a double homicide and the relief that came from transferring responsibility to someone with experience investigating violent deaths in communities where everyone knew everyone and suspects might be neighbors or relatives of the investigating officers. "They're still at the residence," Thomas said, as they climbed into his pickup truck for the short drive to the crime scene. "I secured the scene and kept everyone out except the medical examiner who flew in from Fairbanks about 30 minutes before you arrived. She's waiting for you to complete the initial investigation before moving the bodies." The residence that housed both the general store and the living quarters for Frank and Linda sat at the center of the village, a two-story structure that had been expanded over decades to accommodate both commercial and residential functions. The store occupied the ground floor with large windows that displayed goods ranging from groceries to hardware supplies, while the family's living space filled the second floor with views overlooking the river and the opposite bank where forest stretched unbroken to horizons that seemed impossibly distant. Yellow crime scene tape marked the perimeter that Thomas had established, keeping curious villagers at a distance that allowed them to watch without contaminating evidence that might be critical to understanding what had happened during the hours when Frank and Linda were killed. Halden approached the scene with the methodical care that experience had taught him was essential when investigating crimes in locations where backup forensic support might not be available for days, and where contamination or evidence loss could make prosecution impossible regardless of how obvious the perpetrator's identity might seem. He documented the exterior of the building with photographs that captured the undisturbed snow around entrances and the absence of obvious signs of forced entry that might indicate how the killer had accessed the residence. The front door was unlocked, as the son had reported, swinging open when Thomas demonstrated how he had found it during the initial response that had confirmed the presence of bodies and triggered the call for state trooper assistance. The interior of the store appeared normal at first glance. Merchandise arranged on shelves in the casual organization that characterized rural Alaska commercial operations, where inventory was limited by transportation costs and customer needs, were predictable enough that elaborate displays were unnecessary. But closer inspection revealed subtle disturbances that suggested someone had been searching for something among the goods that filled the retail space. Boxes had been moved and not returned to their original positions. Shelving showed gaps where items had been removed and not replaced, and the cash register stood open with the drawer extended to show an interior that was empty of currency but still contained the receipt tape and change coins that would normally be secured at the end of each business day. Halden moved through the store toward the stairs that led to the residential level, noting that the disturbances increased in frequency as he approached the stairwell, suggesting that whoever had conducted the search had become less careful or more desperate as they progressed deeper into the building. The stairway itself showed no signs of struggle or blood spatter that might indicate violence had occurred during movement between floors, but the worn wooden steps creaked underfoot with sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in the silence that filled the building and pressed against Halden's consciousness with the weight of recent tragedy and unanswered questions. The bodies were discovered in the second-floor living room, positioned in ways that immediately struck Halden as staged rather than representing the natural collapse positions of people who had died during the struggle or sudden violence. Frank sat in a recliner facing the television, his posture relaxed except for the ligature marks on his neck that indicated strangulation as the cause of death. Linda was positioned on the couch approximately 6 feet from her husband, her body arranged to suggest she had been watching television alongside Frank when death occurred. But the medical examiner, Dax, who was documenting the scene with careful attention to detail that reflected years of experience with violent deaths in remote locations, had already identified evidence that contradicted the peaceful tableau the killer had attempted to create. "They weren't killed here," Dax said when Halden approached to review the preliminary findings that would guide the investigation's initial direction. Lividity patterns indicate the bodies were moved several hours after death, positioned in these locations to suggest they died during routine evening activities. But the actual deaths occurred elsewhere, probably downstairs in the store area based on trace evidence I've recovered from their clothing and the defensive wounds on Linda's hands that indicate she fought back against an attacker before being overpowered and killed. The revelation transformed the scene from a simple homicide investigation into something more complex, suggesting a killer who had taken time to stage the bodies in ways designed to mislead investigators, or perhaps to send a message to the community that remained unclear in its specifics, but was definitely intentional in its execution. Halden worked with Dax to document every detail of the scene, photographing the bodies from multiple angles and collecting trace evidence that might provide DNA or other forensic links to the perpetrator. The ligature marks on both victims were consistent with a rope or cord that had been used to strangle them, applied with enough force to cause death within minutes, but showing characteristics that suggested the killer had experience or training in methods that would minimize struggle and noise, that might alert others to violence occurring in a building that sat at the center of a small community where unusual sounds would be noticed and investigated. The wounds on Linda's hands were defensive, deep cuts that indicated she had grabbed the ligature in an attempt to prevent strangulation. Her efforts unsuccessful, but leaving tissue samples beneath her fingernails that might provide the DNA evidence needed to identify her killer if that person was in any forensic database. The search of the residence revealed that the killer had been methodical in examining the couple's possessions, opening drawers and cabinets, examining documents and personal items with attention that suggested they were looking for something specific, rather than conducting a general theft of valuables. The couple's bedroom had been completely searched with mattress moved and closets emptied, but expensive items including jewelry and cash were left undisturbed in locations where they would be easily visible to anyone conducting even a casual search for items worth stealing. The pattern suggested a perpetrator whose motive went beyond simple robbery to include information or objects that had value beyond monetary worth, something that Frank and Linda possessed that was worth killing for, but that might not be recognized as valuable by someone unfamiliar with its significance. Halden interviewed the son who had discovered the bodies, a man in his 30s named Joseph, who operated a subsistence fish camp downstream from the village and maintained minimal contact with his parents beyond the necessary interactions related to obtaining supplies from their store. Joseph's statement described arriving at the store at approximately 3:45 a.m., finding the front door unlocked in violation of his parents' invariable habit of securing the building before retiring for the evening, and discovering the bodies arranged in the living room in positions that he immediately recognized as artificial, because his parents never watched television together and rarely spent evening hours in the living room when the store required accounting work that kept them busy until late each night during the season when river traffic brought customers from other villages and fish camps. The timeline Joseph provided was verified by other village residents who reported seeing lights in the store until approximately 11:30 p.m. on the previous evening, consistent with Frank and Linda's normal pattern of staying open late to serve customers who worked irregular hours, or who stopped by after completing evening activities that might extend well beyond standard business hours. But no one reported seeing or hearing anything unusual during the hours between the store's closing and Joseph's discovery of the bodies. A silence that was troubling in a community where normal sounds carried easily through the still air, and where residents were attuned to patterns that might indicate problems requiring community response. Halden expanded the investigation to include interviews with village residents who might have information about the hours surrounding the murders, or knowledge about potential conflicts that could motivate someone to kill the couple who served as commercial and social hub for the community. The interviews revealed a complex web of relationships and tensions that existed beneath the surface cooperation necessary for survival in remote Alaska villages where interdependence was essential, but privacy was nearly impossible, and grudges could persist for generations without resolution or forgiveness. Several residents mentioned that Frank had been involved in a dispute with another villager over fuel delivery priorities during the previous winter, when shortage had forced difficult decisions about who would receive limited supplies during the cold months, when heating fuel meant the difference between survival and freezing to death in temperatures that could drop to 60 below zero. The disputed fuel distribution had occurred 8 months before the murders, time enough that Halden initially dismissed it as motive for violence that seemed disproportionate to the underlying conflict. But follow-up interviews revealed that the dispute had never been resolved to the satisfaction of all parties, and had created divisions within the village that affected everything from council decisions to social interactions that were complicated by taking sides in a controversy that most outside observers would consider minor, but that held significance within the tight social structure of a community where cooperation was essential for survival. The villager who had been denied fuel during the shortage was identified as Martin, a commercial fisherman whose equipment had suffered damage during the cold months when he lacked adequate heating for his workshop and storage facilities. Martin's interview revealed a man who harbored significant resentment toward Frank for the fuel distribution decision, but who also had an alibi for the evening of the murders that was verified by multiple witnesses who placed him at a village council meeting that had extended until after midnight and had been followed by a social gathering at another resident's home where Martin had remained until approximately 2:00 a.m. The timeline made it physically impossible for Martin to have committed the murders unless he had an accomplice, or unless the medical examiner's preliminary estimate of time of death was significantly inaccurate. Halden noted Martin's animosity toward the victims but was forced to eliminate him as a primary suspect based on the strength of his alibi and the lack of any evidence connecting him to the crime scene or the victims during the relevant time period. The investigation took an unexpected direction when Halden discovered that the village's internet connection had been experiencing unusual outages during the week preceding the murders. Disruptions that the local telecommunications technician attributed to equipment failures, but that created patterns suggesting deliberate interference rather than random technical problems. The outages had occurred during evening hours when internet usage was typically highest, effectively isolating the village from outside communication during periods when residents might normally be checking email or communicating with family members in other locations. The pattern was troubling because it suggested someone might have been deliberately creating communication difficulties in preparation for actions that required isolation from outside contact or immediate response from law enforcement agencies that might be monitoring electronic communications for indications of criminal activity. Halden requested detailed logs of internet and telephone activity from the telecommunications provider, discovering that someone in the village had been conducting extensive online research about forensic investigation techniques during the month preceding the murders. The searches included queries about DNA evidence, crime scene staging, and methods for avoiding detection during criminal investigations, all originating from an IP address that was registered to the village's public computer terminal located in the community center building. The terminal was available to any village resident and maintained minimal logging of user activity, making it impossible to definitively identify who had conducted the research without additional evidence that might connect specific individuals to the searches during the times they occurred. The community center's security was minimal. The building was unlocked during daylight hours and accessible to anyone with legitimate business or casual interest in using the public facilities that included the computer terminal, a small library, and meeting rooms used for council sessions and community gatherings. But the director who managed the center's operations maintained an informal log of visitors that included notes about who used various facilities and when they accessed the building for purposes that might be relevant to managing resources and scheduling maintenance activities. The log revealed that Era, a village elder who served on the tribal council and was widely respected for her knowledge of traditional practices and cultural protocols, had been using the computer terminal during evening hours in the weeks before the murders, a pattern that was unusual for someone who had previously shown minimal interest in internet access or electronic communication. Halden approached Era with caution. Understanding that interviewing a tribal elder required sensitivity to cultural protocols, and awareness that accusations or aggressive questioning could damage the investigation by creating resistance from community members who might otherwise cooperate with law enforcement efforts. Era received him in her home, a traditional structure that combined modern amenities with cultural elements that reflected her role as keeper of community knowledge and traditions. She was forthcoming about her computer usage, explaining that she had been researching medical conditions affecting several elderly village residents and had expanded her searches to include general information about various topics that interested her as she became more comfortable with internet technology and the vast information resources it provided. But when Halden carefully raised the topic of the specific searches related to forensic investigation and crime scene techniques, Era's demeanor shifted from cooperative to guarded, her responses becoming less detailed and her body language suggesting discomfort with the direction the interview was taking. She acknowledged that she had conducted some searches related to law enforcement topics, but characterized them as general curiosity rather than research with specific criminal application. Her explanation was plausible, given the limited entertainment options in remote villages and the natural human interest in topics related to crime and investigation that manifested in widespread consumption of true crime media across demographic groups. But Halden's instincts suggested that Era was concealing something beyond simple curiosity, that her research had purpose she was unwilling to disclose during an interview that was technically voluntary but carried implicit pressure given the context of a double homicide investigation. The investigation reached a critical point when Dax completed the full autopsy examinations and discovered evidence that fundamentally changed the direction of the inquiry. The DNA recovered from beneath Linda's fingernails matched genetic material found in the village's limited database of samples collected during previous investigations and routine processing of individuals who had been arrested for misdemeanor offenses over the years. The match identified the contributor as Peter, Era's adult grandson who lived in Fairbanks but visited the village periodically to maintain connections with family and participate in subsistence activities that were protected by tribal sovereignty and cultural tradition. Peter had a minor criminal record that included arrests for assault and theft, convictions that had resulted in probation rather than incarceration, but that established him as someone capable of violence and willing to engage in criminal activity when motivated by need or opportunity. The discovery of Peter's DNA beneath Linda's fingernails provided the physical evidence needed to establish his presence at the crime scene during the time when the murders occurred, but it raised questions about motive and opportunity that required additional investigation before charges could be filed with confidence that prosecution would succeed. Peter's known whereabouts during the evening of the murders were unclear. He had been visiting the village, but his specific activities and movements were not documented by witnesses who could provide alibi or confirmation of his presence at locations other than the crime scene. Halden returned to Era's residence to conduct a follow-up interview, this time accompanied by Thomas in his official capacity as village public safety officer to provide cultural liaison and community credibility that might encourage cooperation from an elder who was clearly protecting information relevant to the investigation. Era's response to questions about her grandson's activities revealed the depth of family loyalty that complicated law enforcement efforts in communities where kinship obligations often superseded cooperation with outside authorities. She acknowledged that Peter had been in the village during the time of the murders but insisted that he had been with her throughout the evening, providing an alibi that directly contradicted the DNA evidence and the physical impossibility of being in two locations simultaneously. Her willingness to provide false testimony to protect her grandson was culturally understandable within traditional frameworks that prioritized family over external legal systems, but it created obstacles to investigation that required careful navigation to avoid alienating community members whose cooperation might be essential to understanding the full scope of what had occurred during the hours when Frank and Linda were killed. The confrontation with evidence became unavoidable when Halden presented Era with the DNA results and the medical examiner's conclusions about how the genetic material had been deposited beneath Linda's fingernails during a violent struggle that occurred during the commission of strangulation. Era's facade of protective denial cracked when faced with scientific evidence that couldn't be explained away by claims of coincidence or contamination, and she finally revealed the truth that she had been concealing since the morning when she learned about the murders from village residents who spread news through informal networks that operated faster than official communication channels. Peter had come to her house at approximately midnight on the night of the murders, his clothing disheveled and showing signs of struggle, his hands marked with scratches that he claimed were from dealing with fishing nets at a friend's boat, but that Era had immediately recognized as defensive wounds inflicted by someone fighting for their life. Era's statement described how Peter had confessed to the killings during the early morning hours, explaining that he had gone to the store seeking money to pay debts he had accumulated in Fairbanks through gambling and drug use that had spiraled beyond his ability to manage through legitimate employment. He had expected to find cash in the store's register and in the couple's living quarters, money that Frank and Linda were rumored to keep on hand for emergency purchases and to provide loans to village residents who needed assistance during periods of financial difficulty. But the couple had awakened during his search and had confronted him in the store area where struggle had escalated to violence when Linda attempted to call for help and Frank tried to physically restrain the intruder he had recognized as Era's grandson, despite the darkness and confusion of unexpected confrontation. The strangulation had been accomplished with rope that Peter had found in the store's inventory, material that he had used to kill both victims before, staging their bodies in the living room configuration that he believed would mislead investigators into thinking they had died during peaceful evening activities rather than during violent struggle in the commercial space below. Peter's knowledge of forensic investigation techniques had come from discussions with Era during the period when she was conducting her internet research. Conversations that she now understood had been his attempt to prepare for criminal activities rather than expressions of intellectual curiosity about law enforcement methods. Her research had been motivated by suspicion that her grandson was planning something illegal. Her searches for information about DNA evidence and crime scene investigation, representing attempts to understand how law enforcement might pursue cases so that she could warn Peter about the risks he was taking if he followed through on plans that she sensed, but that he had not explicitly disclosed. The revelation of Era's complicity, even if unintentional, in providing Peter with knowledge that he used to attempt concealment of his crimes, added another layer of tragedy to a case that had already devastated the small community through the loss of 2 residents who had served essential functions in the village's social and economic structure. Halden was faced with decisions about whether to charge Era as accessory after the fact for providing false alibi and concealing evidence, or to recognize that her actions had been motivated by family loyalty that was deeply embedded in cultural traditions that predated state law and carried obligations that many outside observers would struggle to understand or accept as mitigation for actions that had obstructed justice and delayed apprehension of a killer who might have fled the area if not for family connections that ultimately led to his identification. Peter was located and arrested in Fairbanks 3 days after the DNA evidence established his presence at the crime scene, found in a motel room where he had been hiding while attempting to arrange transportation to Seattle, where he believed he could disappear into the urban anonymity that was impossible in Alaska's small communities where newcomers were noticed and questioned about their origins and purposes. His arrest was accomplished without incident. The physical evidence against him was overwhelming, and his confession to Era had been recorded in a statement she provided after accepting that her grandson's crimes could not be protected through false testimony or concealment of information that law enforcement would eventually discover through investigation techniques that had advanced beyond the ability of criminals to avoid detection through staging or misdirection. The trial became a community event that divided village residents between those who believed Peter should receive maximum punishment for killing respected members of the community and those who advocated for understanding his actions in the context of addiction and economic pressures that affected many young Alaska natives who struggled to find place in societies that existed between traditional subsistence lifestyles and modern economic systems that required cash income and job skills that were difficult to acquire in remote locations with limited educational and employment opportunities. The prosecution presented overwhelming physical evidence and testimony from the medical examiner that established beyond reasonable doubt that Peter had killed Frank and Linda during the commission of robbery that had escalated to murder when the victims resisted and attempted to summon help. The defense attempted to argue that the killings had not been premeditated, that Peter had gone to the store seeking to borrow money rather than steal it, and that the violence had erupted spontaneously when the situation escalated beyond his ability to control. But the evidence of crime scene staging and the research into forensic investigation techniques that had preceded the murders undermined claims of spontaneous violence and supported prosecution arguments that Peter had planned the robbery with awareness that he might need to kill the victims to avoid identification and apprehension. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on 2 counts of first-degree murder and multiple related charges including robbery and evidence tampering. The sentencing phase revealed the extent of damage that Peter's actions had inflicted on the community beyond the immediate loss of 2 lives. Victim impact statements described how the murders had destroyed the sense of security that village residents had previously enjoyed despite the isolation and the economic challenges that characterized life in remote Alaska. The knowledge that violence could erupt within their community, perpetrated by someone they knew and trusted as member of a respected family, had fundamentally altered the social dynamics that had previously allowed people to leave doors unlocked and to trust neighbors with property and personal safety. The fear extended beyond concern about additional violence to include anxiety about how the legal system would treat Era and other family members who had been caught between loyalty to Peter and obligations to cooperate with law enforcement investigating serious crimes. Era was ultimately charged with lesser offenses related to providing false statements to law enforcement and concealing evidence, charges that reflected prosecutors' understanding that her actions had been motivated by cultural obligations rather than criminal intent to obstruct justice. Her sentencing included probation and community service requirements that allowed her to remain in the village where her knowledge and cultural leadership were essential to community functions that could not easily be transferred to others with equivalent expertise and respect. The resolution was controversial among law enforcement officials who believed that stronger charges were warranted by her actions, but it reflected practical recognition that destroying Era's standing in the community would inflict additional harm on village residents who had already suffered tremendous losses through the murders and the subsequent investigation that had exposed divisions and conflicts that many had preferred to keep private. For Halden, the case exemplified the unique challenges of investigating serious crimes in Alaska villages where cultural traditions, family loyalties, and geographic isolation created complexities that urban law enforcement rarely encountered. The physical evidence had been straightforward and had led inexorably to Peter's identification and conviction, but the investigation had required navigating social structures that operated according to rules that sometimes conflicted with state legal requirements and evidentiary standards. The success of the prosecution had depended on Era's eventual cooperation, despite her initial attempts to protect her grandson. Cooperation that had been achieved through patient interviewing and presentation of evidence rather than through aggressive tactics that might have generated resistance and community backlash against law enforcement presence. The village slowly recovered from the trauma of the murders and the trial, though the recovery was incomplete and was marked by changes in how residents related to each other and approached the basic trust that had previously characterized community interactions. The general store was eventually reopened under new management, but it never regained the central social role it had played when Frank and Linda operated it as a gathering place where residents exchanged news and maintained the informal communication networks that were essential to village life. The building itself carried associations with violence that made some residents uncomfortable, and business patterns shifted to favor purchasing supplies during trips to larger communities rather than relying on local availability that required entering a space where two people had been killed during what should have been routine commercial transaction. Dax's role in the investigation had been critical. The medical examiner's expertise in determining time of death and identifying the staged nature of the crime scene had provided the foundation for understanding what had actually occurred during the hours when Peter was in the store searching for money and confronting victims who had discovered his criminal activity. The DNA evidence had provided the definitive link between Peter and the crimes, but the autopsy findings about body positioning and lividity patterns had revealed the deception that might otherwise have misdirected the investigation toward suspects who lacked connection to the victims or motive for violence that seemed excessive if understood as arising from spontaneous confrontation rather than planned robbery. The case became a training example for Alaska law enforcement agencies dealing with crimes in remote villages where cultural factors and social structures required investigation approaches that differed from urban methodologies. The importance of building relationships with community leaders and respecting cultural protocols while maintaining investigative integrity was emphasized in training programs that used the Tanana murders as illustration of successful navigation of complex social terrain. The case also highlighted the value of forensic evidence in environments where witness testimony might be compromised by family loyalties or cultural obligations that created incentives for concealing information or providing false statements to protect community members from prosecution. Thomas continued serving as village public safety officer, his experience with the murder investigation having provided education in law enforcement techniques that far exceeded the training he had received before assuming duties that normally involved minor offenses and routine public safety matters. His relationship with Halden had developed into a professional partnership that extended beyond the immediate case to include ongoing consultation about law enforcement issues affecting the village and the broader region where isolation created unique challenges for maintaining order and investigating crimes that occurred far from the resources and backup that urban officers could summon within minutes of recognizing need for assistance. The memorial service for Frank and Linda drew attendance from across the region. Residents from multiple villages traveling by boat and aircraft to honor two people who had served their community with dedication that was recognized as exceptional, even in the context of Alaska villages where interdependence and mutual support were essential for survival. The service included traditional elements that reflected the couple's Athabascan heritage, alongside Christian components that acknowledged their participation in religious community that provided spiritual framework for many village residents. The eulogies emphasized their generosity and their willingness to extend credit during difficult times, and to provide assistance that went beyond commercial obligations to include personal support for individuals and families facing challenges that required compassionate response rather than strict business practices. The case files on the Tanana murders remain accessible to law enforcement personnel studying investigation techniques in remote locations. The documentation providing detailed record of how physical evidence was collected and preserved in challenging conditions, and how cultural sensitivities were balanced against investigative requirements in ways that achieved successful prosecution while maintaining relationships with community members whose cooperation might be essential for future law enforcement operations. The investigation had demonstrated that scientific evidence could overcome initial resistance from witnesses who were inclined to protect community members or who were skeptical of outside law enforcement authority. For the Alaska State Troopers who continued investigating crimes in remote villages across the state, the Tanana case served as a reminder that isolation and cultural complexity added dimensions to law enforcement work that required patience, cultural competence, and willingness to adapt standard procedures to circumstances that might not be addressed in training programs designed primarily for urban environments. The successful resolution of the case, despite initial obstacles and the complex social terrain, had reinforced confidence that serious crimes could be investigated effectively in even the most remote locations, if investigators maintained professional standards while respecting the communities they served and the cultural context within which crimes occurred. The village of Tanana continues its existence at the confluence of two great rivers, its residents maintaining lifestyles that combine traditional subsistence practices with participation in cash economy that requires employment and commercial activities that connect them to broader Alaska society. The murders remain part of community memory, referenced in conversations about security and social relationships, but gradually being integrated into the longer history of a village that has survived numerous challenges over generations of occupation in an environment that tests human endurance and social cohesion. The general store operates under different ownership, but continues providing essential services, its role in the community having evolved to reflect changed relationships and the awareness that violence can emerge from unexpected sources within small communities where everyone knows everyone, and trust is both essential and potentially dangerous when extended to individuals whose personal struggles might overcome social obligations and moral restraints. The trial had exposed realities about drug addiction and economic pressure affecting young Alaska natives that many community members had preferred not to acknowledge publicly, forcing conversations about social problems that required responses beyond traditional approaches that had worked in earlier generations, but that seemed inadequate for addressing challenges introduced by modern influences and opportunities. The discussions led to community initiatives focused on substance abuse prevention and economic development that might provide legitimate opportunities for young people who otherwise faced limited options beyond subsistence activities or migration to urban areas where they often struggled with cultural displacement and the practical challenges of succeeding in competitive environments that operated according to rules they hadn't been raised to understand or navigate. Peter's incarceration removed him from the community physically, but not from the social networks that continued to include him in considerations of family obligations and cultural identity that persisted despite his criminal actions and the harm he had inflicted on respected community members. His mother and grandmother maintained contact through prison visitation programs and correspondence that kept family relationships intact even as Peter served a sentence that would extend for decades and would prevent his return to the village until he had aged beyond the years when he might have contributed to community life and participated in the subsistence activities that defined much of village existence. The family's struggle with balancing loyalty to Peter against recognition of the gravity of his crimes reflected broader community tensions about how to address serious criminal behavior by members of tight-knit societies where exile or permanent separation was historically rare, and where rehabilitation and reintegration were traditional responses to wrongdoing. Halden returned to Tanana periodically for follow-up investigations and to maintain the professional relationships that had developed during the murder investigation, his presence in the village having shifted from that of outside authority, imposing external legal standards, to something closer to trusted consultant who understood community dynamics and could be approached for guidance when situations arose that required balancing tribal sovereignty against state law enforcement jurisdiction. The evolution of his role reflected the investment of time and cultural sensitivity that the murder investigation had required, building trust that extended beyond the immediate case to create ongoing partnership between state troopers and village leadership that benefited both law enforcement effectiveness and community well-being. The long-term impacts of the case extended to policy discussions at the state level about how to provide adequate law enforcement services to remote villages where isolation created vulnerabilities that urban communities rarely experienced, and where response times to serious crimes could be measured in hours or days rather than the minutes that characterized support available in populated areas. The Tanana murders had demonstrated that even small villages could experience violent crimes that required sophisticated investigation techniques and forensic resources that were available only through coordination with state and federal agencies willing to commit the time and expense necessary to pursue cases in locations where every aspect of law enforcement work was complicated by distance, weather, and cultural factors that required careful navigation. The case also influenced training programs for village public safety officers who served as first responders in remote communities and who needed skills that went beyond basic law enforcement to include cultural mediation, emergency medical response, and the ability to secure crime scenes in ways that would preserve evidence until state troopers or federal investigators could arrive to conduct detailed examinations. Thomas's experience during the Tanana investigation had revealed gaps in training that were subsequently addressed through enhanced programs that prepared village officers for the complex situations they might encounter while working alone in communities where backup was distant, and where decisions made during initial response could determine whether serious crimes would ultimately be solved through prosecution or would remain open cases that eroded community confidence in law enforcement effectiveness. The relationship between ERA and law enforcement remained complicated years after the case concluded. Her cooperation having been essential to solving the murders, but her initial attempts to protect her grandson having created tensions that required time and continued positive interactions to overcome. She gradually resumed her role as community leader and cultural authority, her knowledge and experience being too valuable to the village for her to be permanently marginalized by actions that many residents understood, even if they couldn't fully condone the choices she had made when confronted with the conflict between family loyalty and legal obligations. Her participation in community discussions about preventing future violence and addressing substance abuse demonstrated that she had processed the tragedy in ways that led to constructive engagement rather than defensive withdrawal from leadership responsibilities. The murders had also revealed the extent to which drug addiction and gambling debts affected young Alaska natives who moved between village and urban environments, struggling to maintain cultural connections while participating in cash economy that often led to lifestyle choices and financial pressures that were foreign to traditional subsistence patterns. Peter's pathway to violence had been paved by decisions that began with recreational drug use and casual gambling, but that escalated to dependencies that consumed resources faster than legitimate employment could provide, creating desperation that ultimately led to the robbery attempt that ended in double homicide. The recognition that his trajectory was not unique among young people facing similar cultural and economic tensions led to prevention programs that attempted to address root causes rather than simply responding to criminal behavior after it occurred. The village's general store, now operated by a cooperative that included multiple families rather than a single proprietor, implemented security measures that would have seemed paranoid in earlier times, but that reflected the changed reality of a community that had learned that violence could emerge from within its own population. Cameras monitored the commercial space. Cash was deposited nightly at a secure location outside the building, and closing procedures required two people rather than the single individual approach that Frank and Linda had used during their years of operation. The changes were practical responses to demonstrated vulnerabilities, but they also represented loss of the casual trust that had previously characterized village life, and that many older residents mourned as they adapted to new protocols that emphasized security over the openness that had defined community interactions. The justice system's handling of ERA's role in the case became a precedent for subsequent situations where family members were caught between cultural obligations and legal requirements to cooperate with investigations of serious crimes. Prosecutors developed guidelines that acknowledged the validity of cultural factors, while maintaining that obstruction of justice could not be completely excused by appeals to tradition or kinship loyalty. The balance remained difficult to achieve in practice, requiring case-by-case assessment of motivations, the severity of underlying crimes, and the degree to which family members had actively participated in concealment versus simply failing to volunteer information that might incriminate relatives. The Tanana case provided a framework that recognized cultural context while establishing that certain actions crossed thresholds that required prosecution, even when sympathetic circumstances might support lenient treatment. The forensic evidence that had been decisive in Peter's conviction continued to serve investigative purposes years after the trial, when DNA database expansions allowed comparison with evidence from unsolved crimes in other jurisdictions. Peter's genetic profile was entered into national systems where it could be compared against evidence from cases across the country, creating the possibility that his DNA might link him to other offenses committed before the Tanana murders, or that patterns in his criminal behavior might provide insights into similar cases where perpetrators remained unidentified. The expanding use of genetic evidence represented technological advancement that was transforming law enforcement capabilities, but that also raised privacy concerns that were particularly acute in Alaska Native communities where collective rights and individual privacy existed in tension that required ongoing negotiation. The isolation that had made the Tanana investigation challenging continued to characterize law enforcement work throughout rural Alaska, where geographic factors created practical barriers that no amount of training or resource allocation could completely overcome. Response times to serious crimes remained measured in hours for even the closest backup. Weather continued to ground aircraft and make travel impossible during critical periods when immediate action might prevent additional violence or evidence loss. And cultural factors required approaches that differed significantly from urban law enforcement models that dominated training programs and shaped expectations about how investigations should proceed. The Tanana case had demonstrated that success was possible despite these challenges, but it had also reinforced awareness that each rural investigation required adaptation and patience that tested the capabilities of even experienced troopers who understood the unique demands of Alaska law enforcement. The memorial for Frank and Linda that was installed in the village cemetery included inscriptions in both English and Athabascan, acknowledging their bicultural identity and their roles in bridging traditional and modern aspects of village life. The memorial became a gathering place for community events that honored not only the couple's memory but also the broader commitment to maintaining social cohesion, despite the traumas that periodically tested village resilience. The annual memorial service evolved to include discussions about preventing violence and supporting families dealing with addiction or economic stress, transforming remembrance into active engagement with the issues that had contributed to the tragedy and that continued to affect community members who struggled with similar pressures that had overwhelmed Peter. For law enforcement personnel across Alaska, the Tanana case remained a reference point for discussions about investigating serious crimes in remote locations where every aspect of standard procedure required modification to accommodate circumstances that urban officers rarely encountered. The case files were studied for insights into evidence collection under challenging conditions, interviewing techniques that respected cultural protocols while obtaining necessary information, and coordination between different agencies and jurisdictions that brought complementary capabilities to investigations that exceeded the resources available to any single organization. The successful prosecution had demonstrated that rural cases could meet evidentiary standards that would survive appellate review, but it had also shown the extensive effort required to achieve results that might be accomplished more easily in urban settings where resources and expertise were readily available. The Yukon River continued its eternal flow past the village, carrying water from distant mountains to the sea, and serving as highway for subsistence activities and commercial traffic that connected Tanana to the broader river system that had supported human occupation for thousands of years. The river's constancy provided counterpoint to the human dramas that unfolded along its banks, reminding residents that their individual tragedies occurred within larger temporal and geographic contexts, that diminished the significance of events that seemed overwhelming when experienced directly. The perspective offered by the river's indifference was both comforting and troubling, suggesting that healing would come with time, but also that the community's struggles registered barely at all in the natural systems that would continue regardless of human presence or absence. The case's resolution had brought closure in the legal sense, with Peter convicted and sentenced for crimes that had been proven beyond reasonable doubt through physical evidence and investigative work that had overcome initial obstacles and cultural complexities. But emotional and social closure remained incomplete for many village residents who continued processing the reality that someone they had known since childhood had killed two respected community members during a robbery that reflected desperation and poor judgment rather than calculated evil. The ongoing struggle to reconcile Peter's actions with memories of the child and young man he had been before addiction and debt created pressures that he lacked the resources or support to manage effectively demonstrated that justice system outcomes provided only partial resolution to traumas that affected entire communities and that required healing processes that extended far beyond courtroom proceedings. The distress call came through on a frequency that hadn't been active in 17 years, crackling with interference that suggested transmission equipment operating far beyond its intended service life. Soren heard the broken message at 2:34 a.m., while monitoring emergency channels during a routine patrol shift that covered the western coastal areas where population density approached zero and where the boundary between land and sea became ambiguous during storms that drove waves inland. The voice was male, middle-aged, speaking English with an accent that suggested Eastern European origins, requesting immediate assistance at coordinates that placed the caller at the abandoned Coast Guard station on Amatignac Island, a facility that had been decommissioned in 2006 and supposedly remained unoccupied except for occasional visits by researchers or maintenance personnel checking on structures gradually succumbing to the harsh coastal environment. Soren acknowledged the transmission and attempted to obtain additional information about the nature of the emergency and the caller's identity, but the response was fragmented and largely unintelligible through static that suggested either equipment malfunction or atmospheric interference. What he could discern indicated that someone was injured or trapped at the abandoned outpost and required evacuation to medical facilities that were hours away even under optimal conditions. The coordinates were verified against navigation charts showing the old Coast Guard station at the northern tip of Amatignac, positioned on a rocky promontory that offered commanding views of shipping lanes that had once been strategically important but now carried minimal traffic due to changes in commercial routing and the decline of fisheries that had previously brought vessels into these dangerous waters. Transportation to Amatignac required coordination with Taryn, a bush pilot whose services were contracted by Alaskan State Troopers for accessing remote locations, unreachable by road or boat. Taryn operated a de Havilland Coen beaver equipped with floats that allowed landing on sheltered waters near coastal sites, and her experience with Aleutian weather patterns made her one of the few pilots willing to attempt flights during marginal conditions that grounded less experienced aviators. She agreed to attempt the flight with the caveat that landing would depend on conditions at the site and that extraction might be delayed by hours or days if weather deteriorated before they could complete the mission and return to mainland facilities where the aircraft could be secured against storms. The flight departed from Dutch Harbor at 4:47 a.m., navigating through darkness that was absolute except for the aircraft's navigation lights and occasional glimpses of white water, marking reefs or shallow areas where waves broke with force that could destroy vessels or aircraft that miscalculated approach vectors. Taryn flew using instruments supplemented by her mental map of the coastline and its hazards, occasionally dropping altitude to verify position against landmarks barely visible through the darkness and sea spray that coated the windscreen and reduced visibility to feet rather than miles. Soren occupied the co-pilot seat but contributed nothing to navigation beyond monitoring GPS coordinates and confirming their course remained aligned with the destination. Amatignac emerged from darkness as a darker mass against black ocean, its presence confirmed more by the change in wave patterns and the sound of surf against rocky shores than by visual distinction. Terran circled the island twice while searching for the sheltered cove that charts indicated existed on the eastern side of the promontory, where the Coast Guard station had been constructed to take advantage of natural protection from prevailing winds. The cove appeared during the second circuit, marked by the absence of white water and by the distinctive echo pattern that her practiced ear recognized as indicating enclosed water with sufficient depth for float landing if approached from the correct angle. The landing was accomplished with skill that came from thousands of hours flying in conditions that would terrify pilots trained in more forgiving environments. The floats touching water with barely a jolt, and the aircraft settling into the gentle swell. Terran maneuvered toward a deteriorating dock that extended from the rocky shore, the structure's condition questionable, but apparently still capable of serving as a temporary mooring point. Soren prepared his equipment while the aircraft approached the dock, gathering the emergency medical kit and checking his radio to confirm that communication with the district office remained possible despite the isolation. The dock's surface was treacherous with decay and marine growth that made each step uncertain. But the structure held under their weight as they moved towards the shore, where a trail led upward toward the cluster of buildings that constituted the abandoned Coast Guard station. The trail was barely visible in darkness, marked more by the absence of dense vegetation than by any maintained path. Soren led the way with his flashlight cutting a narrow cone of illumination through the darkness and revealing glimpses of structures ahead that matched the configuration shown on facility plans transmitted during the flight. The station consisted of a main operations building, 3 residential structures that had housed personnel during active periods, and several outbuildings that had served equipment storage and maintenance functions. The main operations building loomed ahead, a 2-story structure constructed of concrete and steel designed to withstand Aleutian weather, but showing signs of deterioration from years without maintenance. The building's windows were dark except for a faint glow visible on the second floor, barely perceptible, but suggesting that someone had established presence and had access to power sources that should have been disconnected during decommissioning. Soren approached cautiously, aware that the distress call might represent legitimate emergency, but also conscious that abandoned facilities sometimes attracted squatters or criminal elements seeking isolated locations where activities could proceed without observation. The main entrance was secured with a chain and padlock showing signs of forced entry, the metal distorted in ways indicating someone had used tools to break the lock mechanism. Soren documented the damage with photographs before entering the building, noting that the forced entry was relatively recent, based on the absence of corrosion on exposed metal surfaces. The interior was dark and smelled of mold and decay, the scent of abandonment that characterized structures left unoccupied for extended periods in humid environments. His flashlight beam revealed a reception area stripped of most equipment during decommissioning, empty desks and bare walls marking where operational materials had been removed when the facility was closed. Soren called out to announce his presence, identifying himself as Alaskan State Trooper responding to the distress call and requesting that the caller reveal his location. The response came from somewhere above, a voice weakened by distress confirming that the caller was on the second floor and requesting immediate help with a situation he described as critical, but did not explain in detail. Soren proceeded toward the stairwell that provided access to the upper level, moving carefully through the darkened building and testing each step before committing his weight to surfaces that might have deteriorated during years of abandonment. The second floor revealed a more complex situation than anticipated. The space that had once served as the communication center had been converted into makeshift living quarters, with sleeping bag, camping equipment, and supplies indicating that someone had been occupying the abandoned facility for an extended period rather than simply taking temporary shelter. But the occupant was nowhere visible in the room, and the source of the voice that had responded to Soren's announcement remained unclear despite the confined space that should have made concealment impossible. Soren's attention was drawn to communication equipment occupying one corner of the room, a collection of devices that appeared to be a mixture of original Coast Guard systems and more recent additions suggesting someone had been attempting to restore or supplement the facility's transmission capabilities. The equipment was powered by a portable generator that Soren could hear running somewhere in the building, the sound barely audible through thick walls but distinctive enough to confirm that electrical power was available and being used to operate systems that should have been permanently disabled. The communication console displayed activity indicators suggesting that transmissions were being sent or received, but specific content was not immediately apparent. A closer examination of communication logs revealed the disturbing fact that equipment had been transmitting actively for several weeks, sending messages on frequencies monitored by maritime traffic and emergency services across a broad geographic area. The logs showed patterns inconsistent with emergency distress calls, instead suggesting regular scheduled communications with recipients whose identities were not recorded, but whose response patterns indicated coordination beyond simple acknowledgement. Soren photographed the equipment while attempting to understand what purpose the abandoned outpost was serving for whoever had established this unauthorized communication operation. The voice called out again, this time from a different location within the building, the sound seeming to originate from below rather than from the second floor. The shift in apparent source location was disorienting and suggested either that multiple people were present or that acoustic properties of the deteriorating structure were creating echoes that made it difficult to accurately determine the origin of sounds. Soren moved back toward the stairwell, calling out again for the distress caller to identify his location and describe the emergency, but the only response was silence broken by the distant generator and the constant background noise of wind and waves. The first floor search revealed evidence of activity that deepened the mystery. One of the former storage rooms had been converted into what appeared to be a workshop containing tools and materials suitable for electronic repair and modification, suggesting that whoever was occupying the facility possessed technical skills and was engaged in activities requiring precision work. The workshop included components that Soren recognized as belonging to modern satellite communication systems, items far more sophisticated than equipment that would have been installed during the facility's original operational period. Adjacent to the workshop was a room converted into living space more extensive than the temporary quarters on the second floor, with provisions indicating long-term occupation and amenities suggesting the resident had invested significant effort in making the abandoned facility habitable. Personal effects included documentation in Russian and English, confirming that the occupant was of Eastern European origin, as Soren had surmised from the accent. The documents included what appeared to be technical manuals related to radio communication and signal processing, materials that would be expected for someone operating sophisticated transmission equipment, but that also raised questions about purposes being served by maintaining communication capabilities at a location with no official function. Soren's radio crackled with transmission from Terran, reporting that weather conditions were deteriorating more rapidly than forecast, and that extraction might become impossible if they remained beyond the next hour. The warning added urgency, but also created pressure to locate the distress caller and determine whether genuine emergency required evacuation, despite complications that would arise from attempting to transport an unidentified individual whose presence suggested possible criminal activity. Soren acknowledged Terran's warning and continued the search, moving through remaining ground floor rooms while calling out repeatedly for the person who had transmitted the distress signal. The basement access was located in the building's northwest corner, a steel door that stood partially open and revealed stairs descending into darkness that Soren's flashlight barely penetrated. The air rising from the basement carried scents of salt water and diesel fuel, suggesting the lower level had experienced flooding or that fuel storage tanks had leaked during years of abandonment. Soren descended carefully, testing each step and maintaining communication with Taryn to ensure someone knew his location within the facility. The basement revealed the functional core of the unauthorized occupation, a space converted into a sophisticated communication and monitoring center that far exceeded capabilities suggested by equipment visible on upper floors. Multiple computer systems were arranged in configurations suggesting serious signal processing and data analysis capabilities, with screens displaying real-time information about maritime traffic patterns, weather systems, and what appeared to be tracking data for vessels moving through shipping lanes. The installation represented significant investment of resources and expertise, suggesting that whoever had established this facility had backing beyond what an individual operator could provide. Soren was documenting the basement installation when he noticed movement at the periphery of his flashlight beam, a figure partially concealed behind equipment racks in the far corner. He called out identification and orders to reveal himself, but the figure remained motionless in a posture suggesting either injury or deliberate concealment. Soren approached cautiously with hand near his service weapon, but not drawn, aware that the situation might involve medical emergency but also conscious that he was dealing with unknown individual who had established unauthorized operation in an isolated location. The figure was revealed to be a man consistent with the age and appearance suggested by the voice in the distress transmission, approximately 50 years old, with features confirming Eastern European ancestry and showing signs of extended isolation and stress. The man identified himself as Dmitri, claiming to be a researcher studying maritime communication patterns and radio propagation in the Aleutian environment, an explanation contradicted by the sophisticated monitoring equipment and the clandestine nature of the installation. Soren requested identification documents and authorization for occupying the facility, but Dimitri's responses were evasive and his inability to produce official credentials confirmed that the operation was unauthorized. The interrogation was interrupted by urgent transmission from Taryn reporting that weather had deteriorated to the point where immediate departure was essential to avoid being trapped at the site for indeterminate period. Soren was forced to make rapid decisions about whether to evacuate Dmitri, along with evidence, or to secure the scene and return with additional resources when weather permitted. The presence of sophisticated monitoring equipment and suggestion that Dimitri's activities might involve foreign intelligence gathering argued for immediate evacuation and detention, but constraints of available aircraft space and deteriorating weather created practical limitations. Dimitri's physical condition revealed injuries that explained the distress transmission, lacerations on his hands, and a shoulder injury suggesting recent fall in the deteriorating facility. The injuries were serious enough to require medical attention, but not immediately life-threatening, creating additional complexity in decisions about evacuation necessity. The decision was ultimately made by Dmitri himself, who revealed that he had transmitted the distress signal to initiate contact with authorities because health complications beyond visible injuries were forcing him to seek medical intervention that could not be delayed. He claimed to be suffering from cardiac irregularities requiring immediate evaluation, symptoms that could not be verified without medical equipment, but that created ethical obligations for law enforcement to provide assistance regardless of criminal activities. The return to the aircraft was accomplished under deteriorating conditions, wind speeds increasing and visibility decreasing as the storm system moved into the area. Dmitri required assistance navigating the trail from the facility to the dock, his injuries and apparent cardiac issues limiting his mobility and requiring support that delayed progress. Taryn had the aircraft prepared for immediate departure, having monitored their approach and made decisions about engine warm-up that would minimize time between boarding and takeoff. The takeoff was the most challenging phase. Wind gusts creating turbulence that affected the aircraft's stability on water and complicated the acceleration run needed to achieve flying speed before reaching the limits of the sheltered cove. Taryn managed the departure with skill that reflected extensive experience, the aircraft lifting off just as they reached the cove's outer boundary and entering turbulent air. Dmitri occupied the rear seat where he could be monitored while not interfering with operation during conditions that required complete attention to flight control. The flight back to Dutch Harbor took longer than the outbound journey due to headwinds and route deviations necessary to avoid the worst of the weather. Soren used the flight time to conduct preliminary interview with Dmitri, attempting to understand the nature of the operation and determine whether immediate notifications to federal agencies were necessary. Dmitri's responses were carefully vague, acknowledging that his presence was unauthorized, but characterizing his activities as private research rather than intelligence gathering that the sophisticated equipment suggested. Landing at Dutch Harbor required Taryn's full concentration as wind conditions had deteriorated to near the limits of safe operation, requiring multiple approaches before she successfully positioned the aircraft for touchdown on rough water. The aircraft was secured at the dock where emergency medical personnel were waiting to receive Dmitri and transport him to the clinic. Soren maintained custody during the medical transfer, ensuring that Dmitri remained under law enforcement control despite medical necessities. The medical evaluation revealed that Dmitri's cardiac symptoms were genuine, irregular heartbeat, and other indicators suggesting stress-related condition that required monitoring but not immediate intervention beyond medication and rest. The evaluation bought time for Soren to coordinate with federal agencies whose jurisdiction might be implicated by Dmitri's activities. The FBI and other agencies expressed immediate interest when briefed about the sophisticated monitoring equipment and Dmitri's apparent foreign origins, suggesting the case would rapidly expand beyond state law enforcement jurisdiction. Dmitri was transferred to federal custody within hours of arriving at Dutch Harbor, the decision reflecting consensus among agencies that his activities likely involved violations of federal statutes and potentially compromised national security interests. Soren's role transitioned from primary investigator to supporting witness who could provide testimony about circumstances of Dmitri's discovery and initial documentation of the facility. The transition was professionally appropriate, but personally frustrating because Soren's investment of effort and risk would not be followed by continued involvement in understanding what Dmitri had actually been doing. The subsequent investigation of the abandoned outpost required extensive resources and multiple trips by federal agents, who systematically documented the installation and collected equipment for forensic analysis. The investigation revealed that Dmitri had been operating the surveillance facility for over 2 years, having established the installation after verifying that the decommissioned Coast Guard station remained unmonitored and accessible. The monitoring equipment had been tracking naval vessel movements, submarine activities, and other maritime operations that pass through the Aleutian region, collecting data valuable to foreign intelligence services. The evidence suggested that Dmitri had been operating as contractor for foreign intelligence services, providing surveillance data in exchange for financial compensation that had allowed him to sustain the isolated operation and acquire sophisticated equipment necessary for effective monitoring. The revelation that foreign intelligence operations had established presence at an abandoned American military facility highlighted security vulnerabilities that required immediate response to prevent similar exploitation of other decommissioned sites. Dmitri's prosecution proceeded through federal courts on charges including espionage, unauthorized access to government facilities, and violations of communication regulations. His defense attempted to characterize his activities as passive monitoring that did not involve active collection of classified information, but prosecution successfully demonstrated that the data he had been gathering included operational details about American naval movements that were valuable for intelligence purposes. The conviction was secured through testimony from naval intelligence personnel who explained the significance of patterns that Dmitri had been tracking. For Soren, the case represented one of the strangest investigations of his career, beginning with a distress call on an obsolete frequency and ending with exposure of a sophisticated foreign intelligence operation that had been functioning undetected for years. The fact that Dmitri had ultimately summoned law enforcement suggested that health concerns had overcome his commitment to maintaining the clandestine operation, creating the opportunity for discovery that might otherwise have been delayed indefinitely. The abandoned Coast Guard station was eventually demolished by military personnel who determined that leaving the structure intact presented unacceptable security risks given its demonstrated vulnerability to unauthorized occupation. The demolition was accompanied by enhanced surveillance of other decommissioned facilities in the Aleutian chain, with periodic inspections and monitoring systems designed to detect any attempts to establish similar unauthorized operations. The measures represented closing of a vulnerability that Dmitri's operation had exposed, but they also acknowledged the practical reality that monitoring hundreds of abandoned structures across thousands of miles of remote coastline exceeded available resources. Finn, the harbor master at Dutch Harbor, who had assisted with coordinating the aircraft operations during the extraction, became inadvertently involved in the broader investigation when federal agents discovered that one of his employees had been providing fuel and supplies to unknown parties who claimed to be conducting marine research in the outer islands. The employee's cooperation with what he had believed were legitimate researchers illustrated how foreign intelligence operations could exploit the helpful nature of residents in remote communities where visitors were rare, and offers of cash payment for simple services were accepted without skepticism. Finn implemented enhanced verification procedures for transactions involving delivery of supplies to remote locations, requiring documentation and advance coordination with authorities before providing support that might inadvertently facilitate unauthorized activities. The case became a training example for law enforcement personnel operating in remote regions where abandoned infrastructure might be exploited by criminal organizations or foreign intelligence services seeking locations that offered strategic advantages while remaining beyond routine official oversight. The training emphasized the importance of investigating unusual communications or activities even when the effort required seemed disproportionate to the likelihood of discovering genuine emergencies. The Dmitri case had demonstrated that foreign intelligence services were sophisticated enough to identify and exploit vulnerabilities in American security architecture. The Aleutian coast continued its eternal interaction with storm systems that swept across the North Pacific, creating conditions that tested human presence and infrastructure with remorseless efficiency. The demolished Coast Guard station left only foundation remnants and debris that would gradually be consumed by the environment. The strategic significance of the location remained unchanged, offering views of maritime routes that would always be important, but the enhanced surveillance made future unauthorized occupation less likely, even if determined adversaries continued seeking opportunities to exploit American vulnerabilities in regions where vast distances and harsh conditions created practical limitations on official control. The distress call on the obsolete frequency became part of operational lore in Alaska law enforcement circles, cited as example of why unusual communications required investigation even when conventional wisdom suggested that abandoned equipment should be incapable of generating coherent transmissions. The fact that the call had been both genuine emergency and sophisticated intelligence operations' final transmission illustrated the complexity that characterized law enforcement work in regions where isolation created opportunities for activities that would be impossible in more populated environments.